G'day, it's Rick here from Old Man Emu. We're going to do a bit of an overview and a history of the coaching industry in Australia. It was a great industry. It was employing thousands of people, and in its heyday it had about 6,000 horses harnessed up every day. Just to give you an idea of how much work was involved, it was enormous. It was like a modern day Qantas back in the 1800s. Started in 1843 and it ended in 1924, I believe, up in Queensland, but it started in Melbourne. The reason it started, there was a lot of people coming from overseas to Australia because of the great quantity of gold and gold mining that was going on, and there was people from all over the world coming to Melbourne and Sydney looking for their fortune, I guess. But three Americans came that were running the coaching industry in America, Freeman Cobb and his two mates. And they came to Melbourne and they seen a great opportunity to expand their empire in the coaching industry, because they used to have the Concord coaches in America. And so they imported a few Concord coaches from the United States and decided that they'd make their fortune carting the patrons from Melbourne to Ballarat, Bendigo and all around the Victorian goldfields, because there were people travelling by the thousands and there was no transport at all, bar a few drays that were brought over by the English. So they did so, and they brought over a few of these coaches, but they had a lot of trouble with them because they were pretty rigid, the Concord coaches. Being American, they had a better road system, I guess, in the States than what we did in the early 1800s here in Australia. So when they brought their coaches over, they rattled to pieces. So what they had to do, they had to change things, but they didn't have the foresight, I guess, or the ability to expand in that way. So they sold their industry off to a bloke by the name of Rutherford. And he was quite an astute businessman. And what he did, he changed the whole coaching industry for this nation. As I say, it was running 6,000 odd horses every day, with coaches all over the country. But what he changed from the Concord coach to what we now know as the Thoroughbrace, where he put leather straps underneath the coach so that the coach wouldn't bounce around as much and rattle to pieces. It actually rocked on the leather straps that were underneath the coach, and we'll go through that later and explain a bit more about that in another episode. But what they did, it used to make it was that rocky with these Thoroughbrace that it used to make some of the patrons actually seasick, and they used to get the children up on the box seat on the front of the coach so that they didn't get too sick, but the women were never allowed to get on the box seat. There was only one or two that ever did under special circumstances. But it was a very interesting and unique industry. So it started in Melbourne, worked its way all the way up to Bendigo. Like, you'd catch a coach at 6 o'clock in the morning in Melbourne, and the coach would drive all the way up to Bendigo. It'd take you from 6 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock that night. There'd be about 4 to 5 teams of horses that would be changed over in that trip. There'd be 5 in the team of horses that were harnessed to your coach, 3 up front and 2 in the wheel or behind. And then they would, as I say, arrive in Bendigo, 6 o'clock that night, but they'd stop on their different stops on the way, and each time they'd stop, the patrons would hop out, disembark the coach. They'd go into these places that were designated to have the next team ready, and the bloke that owned the place, he would be the one in charge of the horses. He'd harness up the horses and have them ready for the coach, because he knew roughly when they were coming. Patrons would go inside and the wife would feed all the patrons. They'd usually feed them a lot of greasy bacon and salty bacon and eggs and whatever else they had on the farm, and they'd make their money out of that as well. But they'd also get paid for harnessing the horses and having them ready. So as soon as the coach pulled in, the team that got them there, the team of horses that got them there, would be taken off the coach. The new team would be harnessed up to the coach while the patrons were eating their meal. By the time they got to Castlemaine, it'd be about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They were pretty tired. Like, it's a pretty long trip and a very tiring trip, especially bouncing around and getting dust through you. And yes, it was a pretty wild time, or mud, depending on the weather. And by the time they got to Bendigo, they were pretty well wrecked. They had to have a place to sleep, and Bendigo would do quite well out of it as well, because they would put their patrons up in the motels and whatnot if they could afford to. Most of the time they couldn't. They would have their own piece of canvas for a tent where they'd be sleeping under for the next 6-12 months till they hopefully found their fortune in gold. But what we'll do, we'll go through some photos and some other things with it, and we'll talk about that